Hi class, Mr. Clark here. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to put it all together and create a finished drawing using value for the very bottom of our value techniques worksheet. Now, I've tried to help you guys out by including little numbers here that correspond to the same numbers as our shading and smudging that we did at the very start of our technique worksheet. And using these will help you understand what level of value you need to be pressing for each one. So for a 10, for a 10, over here, that would be as hard as you possibly can press. Really, really hard. Lightening up to 9, 8, and then 7 for our background. What we're doing is basically trying to recreate this picture's value as close as possible on this side of the page. Using these numbers will be very helpful if you want to think about them like a percentage of how hard you should press. So for 10, I'm going to be pressing down pretty much as hard as I can to really amp up that pressure and get a nice dark value. So I'm pressing down pretty darn hard to get this dark. Or when you're pressing down really hard, you might break your pencil, which is fine. That's why we always like to have a spare handy. Be careful when you're pressing down really hard so that you don't break off your pencil too much. Now I'm going to be lightening up to a 9, which is still very, very dark, but not quite as hard as my 10. Notice how I'm being very careful around the edges of my shapes because I don't want to go over any of my lines. You can do this with hatching, cross-hatching, or stippling, but most people will choose to use smudging and our regular shading to make it a little easier since that's what most people are used to. Coming back through and adding my value to 9. Then I'm going to continue with my background and lighten up to an 8. And I can create my value fairly quickly using a wooden pencil. It's a little bit harder with a mechanical just because you aren't able to use the full width of your lead in here with the tiny tip of a mechanical pencil. Another one of the reasons that I recommend wooden pencils when drawing. Finally, I'm going to finish up my background by coming in with a 7. The worksheet printed a little weird, so it's pretty close to 7 already just because of the copier being a copier. So you don't have to put down too much value here, but you do still want to lay down some value and not leave this part blank. Note, 7 is still pretty dark, but not nearly as dark as 10. So I'm pressing about 70% as hard as I can, filling in that whole area all the way up to the corner, a little bit lighter. And then I might refine my pressure, coming back and pressing a little bit harder, just refining my background to make sure it goes from 10 to 9, then 8 to 7 to get a nice slowly fading darkness. Now, I might start on my sphere next. And notice how it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 5, since there is a reflected shadow behind my sphere and it's not just straight light to dark. So for a 1, it's very light. I'm barely pressing down here at all. For 2, I'm adding a little bit more, and then I keep picking up my pressure as I go down this sphere until I get to about a little over medium with my 6, where I'm pressing down quite a bit harder than my 1 or 2, but still not super duper dark. Then I lighten back up for my 5, and now I can refine my values, trying to transition from my darks to my lights, lightening up in between each level of value as I go. And that looks pretty good. Notice how these are both 6s. So for my bottom background, I know that my needed value is going to be around the same pressure that I put in my sphere. So I might do that just enough so that I have a start to my value. Then I notice my shadow over here, so I can come start thinking about this shadow right in here. The copier got a little bit carried away and didn't print. And this is another 10. So I'm going to press down really hard on this shadow because it's one of the darkest parts of the entire drawing. Back in here is a little bit lighter, as you can see over here. I didn't put a number on it, but it's probably about the same as a 6 as the regular rest of our background. Continuing to add in more to the bottom. Finishing up. The shadow on my cube is an 8. So once again, it's pretty dark, not quite as dark as the sphere, but still substantially darker than the actual sphere itself. All right, next I might finish up my cylinder. Once again, 1 is incredibly light. I barely want to be pressing at all when shading this part of the drawing. I am very, very, very lightly touching, and I might even come back with my eraser to shade some too. Now I'm going to go from 1 to 3, so I'm adding a little bit more pressure as I shade through this sphere. Coming through, and then I start to get to my actual darks in my 6 and 5. So now I'm pressing quite a bit harder, medium pressure here, and then I lighten up just a little bit as I get to my other edge, since the darkest part of my cylinder is right here towards the back end of there. Add a little bit more dark, and then fade up to my 3. Top of the cylinder is a little bit darker than the side, so it's just a little bit, like just a tiny, tiny bit darker than my 3. So we add that in right along our top. Come back and add a little bit more to my 6, and then fade that from 3 to 6. You really want to be careful of your transition from 6 to 3. It's a hard transition, but you really want to make sure you get all of the 4 and the 5 till you get to the 6. Then you lighten up and go back to 5 towards your edge. For our final shape, here we have our cube. And we'll start by finishing up the shadow cast from our sphere, which is the darkest part on our sphere, which is a 9. So pressing down almost as hard as our base shadow, really, really quite hard. And then coming back to our lightest point, which is a 2. 2s are very, very light. I am barely pressing down at all right now, using maybe about 20% of my pencil pressure in total. Now, as you'll notice, this 6 is the same here as my bottom background. So I know that I want this to be about the same in terms of value. Coming through, adding in my value over the entire sphere. Don't worry about the copier darkness. Once we get everything shaded in, you won't even be able to notice it. All right, and then finally with our 4, adding in just a little bit of value so that it's slightly darker than our cylinder, but not by much. Now, final steps are to come by and make sure that your values look about where you want them in terms of number, and to just make sure everything looks similar. You want to try and get your picture as close to the example picture as possible. So I might come in and add a little bit more value to the edge of my cube, really darken up some of my darkest parts by pressing down even a little bit harder. These tins should be very, very, very dark. So I want to make sure that I press down hard enough for them to look very, very dark. And then finally, I might come with my eraser and just add a little bit, take off a little bit of the value right on the edges of my ones and maybe a little bit on my 2, just to really amp up that contrast along those edges and really make those shapes and forms pop. If you want, you can come back and smudge, but I actually like the way this looks without smudging, so I think I'm going to leave it as is, but you're more than welcome to try smudging. That's all for this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.